What sort of witchcraft is this? The Asus OLED monitor that I've got behind me does 4K at 240Hz, but get this, at a touch of a button can do Full HD at 480Hz. I know it's pretty mind-boggling, and it's very much the first monitor that I've come across that has this dual mode capabilities. Now the monitor does actually have other features. It has got a flat 31.5 inch form factor with a WOLED panel with a matte coating to it, adaptive sync technologies with Nvidia G-Sync certification, and also the display HDR True Black 400 certification, which is absolutely fantastic to see, specifically on a WOLED. Now the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG32UCDP does not come cheap. It costs $1,300 in the US, while availability across Europe and UK is just being announced, but expected to sit at roughly £1,300 or 1,300 euros. Now, is it actually worth its price tag, and is its dual mode capabilities actually something that you should be looking out for? Well, let's find out. So to kick things off, I thought I'd quickly touch upon connectivity, and here it's fantastic to see that you have got a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input with DSC, two HDMI 2.1 ports, and a USB Type-C port which also delivers 90 watts of power. This means that no matter how you connect it up to the monitor, you'll be able to output 4K at 240Hz or Full HD at 480Hz. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about its gaming performance. And first off, its input lag was recorded at 0 milliseconds. Indeed, it is actually very hard to believe, but both at 4K and at Full HD, I recorded no input lag using my measurement tools. This is really impressive to say the least, and some other monitors that I've recently tested have performed similarly. While playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, I can say that subjectively my mouse inputs were absolutely seamless. No issues whatsoever, and therefore when it came to playing hardcore competitive games, I would have no issues whatsoever when it comes to recommending this monitor, at least when it comes to its overall input lag. However, I would like to point out that with adaptive sync technologies enabled, in other words AMD FreeSync or Nvidia G-Sync, I did subjectively notice a little bit of increased input lag. It wasn't so much so that it threw me off, but it's just something I thought I should note, and therefore means that if you do want to play with this monitor and you're going to be playing some more hardcore competitive games, I would side towards disabling adaptive sync technologies altogether. There's a few other reasons behind this as well, but nonetheless just something I thought I should share in terms of my overall experiences while using this monitor. Now when it comes to its response time, it's similarly absolutely stonkingly good. Given this monitor has got a WOLED panel, it's almost no surprise. Tested at 240Hz and at 4K, I noticed an average initial time of 0.73 milliseconds. You can see this at the bottom left hand side of your screen. Similarly, at Full HD and at 480Hz, I clocked in 0.76 milliseconds. So yes, this monitor is stonkingly fast, and therefore means that you're going to have no problems whatsoever when it comes to really playing some intense games. Better still, given this monitor has got that OLED sort of structure, it means you're not going to get any sort of inverse ghosting. There's no sort of overdrive modes that you have to dial in and out. And as such, when it comes to the overall visual clarity, it was absolutely phenomenal. The same could be said about the overall motion clarity as well, specifically when it comes to 480Hz. As you'll be able to see over here via the UFO ghosting test, at 240Hz it's not too bad. It does tail off at 120 and 60Hz, which is almost no surprise, but then at 480Hz it really does take it up one notch. I would say this goes toe-to-toe with some ETN panels that I have tested and some very fast-paced TN IPS or VA panels. That 480Hz and that OLED technology combined means that this monitor's motion clarity is almost second to none. Now there is also ELMB, which stands for Extreme Low Motion Blur, and effectively does exactly what it says on the tin. However, it's only plausible at 120Hz, and therefore is going to be limited to those people who are potentially using this monitor with a modern games console at 120Hz. In this respect, if you're going to be running it with a PC, you're going to want to run 240Hz at 4K instead, or indeed 480Hz at Full HD, because the overall motion clarity, specifically with the latter example, is far superior, as it might be obvious via the UFO ghosting test. Now with that in mind, I thought I should share my own experiences while using this monitor at 4K and at Full HD. Now first off, with the former, I think it was a match made in heaven. The 31.5 inch form factor is great for productivity but also gaming. That WOLED screen looks fantastic, specifically if you enable HDR, and more on that a little bit later, and at 240Hz refresh rate at 4K gives me that good sort of fluidity. However, the overall experiences that I had while running this monitor at Full HD weren't quite the same. Now don't get me wrong, the monitor is fantastically fast and it gives me fantastic motion clarity with no sort of overshoot thanks to its OLED panel technology. However, with that said, the overall form factor of the monitor was a problem. See, 31.5 inch at Full HD severely hampers the overall pixel density and everything just looks a bit grainy and pixelated. Now thankfully there is a means of mitigating this, and Asus have actually thought about this, and indeed via the monitor's OSD you can enable an aspect control, both for square and 16:9. Speaking about the latter over here, I ran it at the 24.5 inch or 27 inch simulation profiles, and this meant the overall muscle memory that I had while using the monitor at the simulated profiles was far better than running it at 31.5 inch. But with that said, the simulated profiles do also have their own issues. See here, the Nvidia control panel reported a different resolution than Full HD, while my in-game Counter-Strike 2 settings recorded Full HD. So I'm not really sure what to really trust over here, but I'll pretty much side towards the Nvidia control panel's resolution. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that if you're going to be using the simulated profiles, it's going to be definitely appreciated for hardcore competitive gamers because you'll be a bit more accustomed to the overall size and form factor, but it's going to hamper the overall resolution that you'll be able to output. Furthermore, the overall sheer form factor on your desk is not going to change. You're going to have massive black bars around the overall simulated profile, and that might be still a bit distracting. Nonetheless, I'll be curious to know what you make of this down the comment section below as to how you would feel with the simulation profiles or indeed running this monitor at Full HD at 31.5 inch. Now moving past hardcore competitive gaming, I would like to talk about using this monitor at 4K at 240Hz because I think it really does excel, specifically if you're running it with adaptive sync technologies or indeed HDR. Now first off, I should point out that variable refresh rate mode cannot be enabled simultaneously with eLMB. In other words, you can't use AMD FreeSync or Nvidia G-Sync with eLMB mode enabled at 120Hz. This might be only applicable for console users, but just something I thought I should highlight. Now here it's also worth mentioning that the monitor has got AMD FreeSync Premium Pro certification and Nvidia G-Sync certification, although it's not an Nvidia G-Sync module monitor. I do think it's a little bit deceptive over here because the manufacturer has provided a Nvidia G-Sync logo and sticker on the monitor itself, which here might throw off certain consumers. Nonetheless, over here, the VR range sits from 48Hz up to 240Hz at 4K and 48Hz up to 480Hz at 1080p. Now, while connected over to my RTX 3080 over DisplayPort, I was able to run some of my tests. And first off, when I went onto the Nvidia Pendulum demo, I did notice a little bit of VRR flicker. That is actually very much occurrent on pretty much every sort of OLED panel that I have tested. But thankfully here, Asus have thought about mitigating it. And via the monitor's OSD, there is an OLED anti-flicker mode, which you can enable with the middle or the high modes. Now in these modes, I actually noticed that the VR flicker pretty much was completely negated. However, if you have got very sensitive eyes, it's just something worth bearing in mind. With it disabled, I did actually notice a bit of flicker and also noticed it in-game. Again, it didn't really throw me off, but again, something I thought I should highlight in the review. Now when it comes to using this monitor at its absolute best, it is with HDR. And indeed, it has given us an absolutely stunning image. Now the WOLED panel has got a display HDR True Black 400 certification, which is fantastic to see. And therefore gives you really true deep blacks that one might expect from an OLED panel. Equally, you can disable the True Black 400 mode to get an even higher brightness, or even enable the adjustable HDR mode. This gives you a peak brightness of over 1100 nits, and it's absolutely blinding. Here, if you're going to be using it with a sort of HDR signal, you're going to be able to get the best out of the monitor. That OLED panel really comes to life, and given the overall qualities that I've mentioned over here at 4K at 240Hz or even Full HD at 480Hz, it means that the overall visual experience is still phenomenal as well. So yes, indeed, over here I was able to run Destiny 2 at Full HD at 480Hz or 4K at 240Hz with Nvidia G-Sync and HDR all simultaneously running without incurring any sort of problems. Of course, do bear in mind what I did mention about the VR flicker, which does occur a little bit, but it's not something that I would be overly concerned about. Now to round off the gaming section, I thought I should have a quick word for console gamers. And yes, indeed, this monitor has got two HDMI 2.1 ports, giving you the full bandwidth capabilities, allowing you to output 4K at 120Hz or 60Hz, or Full HD at 120Hz or 60Hz. Now here, while running it at 4K at 120Hz, I had it tested via the OSRTD tool, and the average initial time, which can be seen at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, set at 0.71 milliseconds. Indeed, it's stonkingly good. The same could be said about 60Hz, where the average initial time sits at 0.66 milliseconds. Although do bear in mind there are some errors on your screen, but these can be negated just due to some software errors. Now when it comes to the overall input lag, I had no means of actually objectively testing it, but subjectively I think it was actually pretty usable. Although 60Hz does actually take a bit of a toll in terms of the overall input lag, and therefore is actually going to be far worse than what I actually recorded at 480Hz or indeed 240Hz. Now when it comes to the motion clarity, as a reminder, at 120Hz it's actually pretty good, although at 60Hz it does actually take a toll again. Now you can enable ELMB, but just do bear in mind this will run only at 120Hz and also will not be able to run simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies. So now that we've established that the gaming performance is stonkingly good, what about when it comes to the overall image clarity? Well, as a reminder, you've got a flat 31.5-inch monitor that runs a WOLED panel and also has got a matte coating to it. Now there is also a dedicated sRGB mode that you can select via the monitor's OSD, and this will also lock a certain preset, although it's good to see that you've got full brightness controls. Now in said mode, I had it tested with its gamut coverage at 90% and its gamut volume of 91.3%. You can see below here how it compares to the sRGB standard. The average LTE set at a very impressive 1.11 with a maximum of 2.89. Therefore means that this monitor can be used for some serious image editing work or video grading. Its tested contrast ratio was infinity to 1, which is no surprise given its OLED panel, and its measured white point sat at 6709 Kelvin at 100% in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target. As for a gamma curve, it sits relatively close to the 2.2 standard. Now if you're not going to be editing in the sRGB color space, you might want to unlock the wider color gamut of this monitor. And indeed over here via the user preset and the DCI-P3 modes with the gamma set at 2.6, I actually noted a positive increase in terms of the gamut coverage and the gamma volume, as you'll be able to see over here when it comes to the Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 modes. Now concentrating on the latter, you can see below how it compares to the DCI-P3 standard. As for the average LTE, it sits at a stonkingly low 0.96 and a maximum of 2.58. So yes indeed, if you're going to be doing any sort of image editing work in the DCI-P3 color space, it is also very accurate, which is actually quite rare to see on a gaming monitor. Its tested contrast ratio does not change, while its measured white point does slightly shift at 6765 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, it's relatively close to the 2.6 standard, which is required for the DCI-P3 color space. Now its color performance is very impressive, and the same could be said about its overall brightness figures. Indeed, for an OLED monitor it does actually get very bright at 1185 nits with the adjustable HDR brightness set to 100%. If you were to enable the HDR True Black mode, this will limit it to 458 nits. Now in the console HDR, gaming HDR and the cinema HDR modes, you'll be able to see that the overall brightness figures are affected. While in SDR, it does actually get relatively bright at 350 nits, which therefore means that it's very much usable in a bright sunlit room. It is worth noting, however, that if you were to enable the sRGB mode, or indeed enable the uniform brightness mode, which does get automatically triggered with the sRGB mode, the overall peak luminance goes down to 258 nits. Still very much usable, although it means that you might have to use the monitor at its higher brightness levels. As for its minimum brightness, it gets down to 73 nits in SDR, although with uniform brightness this goes all the way down to 35 nits, showing good sort of range. Therefore means that this monitor can be used in a very dark room without any sort of issues. Now as for the ELMB brightness, you have actually got an adjustable brightness level, which is great to see, and this goes from 36 nits up to 146 nits, and therefore means that it is actually pretty dim and can only be really useful, at least in my opinion, in a pretty dark room. Moving past the overall luminance figures, I should talk about brightness uniformity, and while I do appreciate it's somewhat panel lottery, given it's an OLED panel, it's no surprise to see that this 31.5-inch monitor does a phenomenal job across the board. The same could be said about the overall backlight bleed, which is non-existent, which is no surprise, and therefore is going to one-up some LCD alternatives out there, specifically those that are using regular IPS VA or TN technology. This picture was actually taken in a completely pitch black room, but my camera was actually trying to overexpose the overall image and therefore made it look a lot brighter than it actually is. Now so far everything I've mentioned about this Asus monitor is seriously impressive, and indeed has left me pretty jaw-dropped. However, there are certain limitations that you should consider, specifically coming from an LCD panel. And indeed over here I'm referring to the OLED panel that it's actually using, or more specifically the burn-in effect, which is something that plagues any sort of OLED monitor out there. Now first off, it's good to know that the manufacturer has provided you a 3-year warranty, which actually one-ups some of its competitors. And equally, it's good to see that you've got a means of mitigating the burn-in effect via the monitor's OSD, or by using the software, the Asus display widget, which is free to download. Now here you've got a few different things that you might want to enable, and some things that you might actually want to disable because it might actually throw you off. Now I would just like to point out that the uniform brightness mode is certainly appreciated, because with it disabled, it means that the monitor does get a little bit brighter, as I did point out before. However, it means that you're going to see a lot of brightness fluctuations. It's not overly severe, but it's certainly noticeable. And this is, for example, if you're going to be minimizing a window, or for example, tabbing it to the left or the right. Now with it enabled, you will actually get a better sort of experience, and also means that you're going to be mitigating the burn-in effect because the monitor won't be getting as bright. So some food for thought. Now elsewhere, I would also like to mention that there is the pixel cleaning mode. This will effectively occur after a certain amount of hours of usage of the monitor. Now you might be thinking this is quite cumbersome and might actually pause your usage of the monitor, but in my case it actually occurred only while it went into standby, so effectively when I was not using the monitor anyway. So it didn't really bother me in the slightest, but just something worth bearing in mind, especially if you have those reminders set up, then you'll just be accustomed to when the pixel cleaning will actually have to occur in order for you to actually mitigate the burn-in effect a little bit better. Now another thing that's really intrigued me when it comes to reviewing a OLED monitor is the overall text clarity. And indeed over here I'm referring to the sub-pixel layout and the fringing effect, which is something that plagues pretty much every single OLED that I've reviewed to date. Thankfully, however, this one changes things a little bit, and indeed is almost the best monitor that I've come across when it comes to using an OLED monitor, and therefore completely mitigating the fringing effect almost altogether. Now here you'll be able to see why, because the sub-pixel layout has changed. This is credit to my friend Simon from TFT Central. If you want to see his review of it, make sure you check it down in the description below. Ultimately, what I'll say over here is that while using this monitor for productivity usage, I actually didn't even notice the fringing effect. Here it is only apparent in certain sort of instances, and even then it's still very hard to notice, thanks to the fact that you are running a 4K resolution. Indeed over here the monitor looks fantastic across the board, and when comparing and contrasting with older generation WOLEDs or even QD-OLEDs, it's actually far better. It still doesn't quite surpass an LCD monitor when it comes to the overall text clarity, but it comes very, very close to it. With all that out of the way, I would like to talk about its overall build quality. And first off, you've got a 4-side boards design, which means that the 31.5-inch form factor doesn't actually take as much space on your desk as you might think. Now the stand itself, however, has got a triangular design, so you might want to weigh it up. In my case, I've got no sort of issues. I also quite like its look, and it's not overly garish in terms of the overall colours that the manufacturer has actually opted for. Now the built-in stand provides you a good sort of sturdy feel, and also has got a height, tilt and swivel adjustments, although it cannot be rotated. The built-in stand also has got a 1/4-inch jack at the top, which allows you to place a camera or, for example, a webcam, which can be handy in certain scenarios. Now if you do want to replace the built-in stand, you can do so via VESA-compatible stand, allowing you to place it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now elsewhere, if you were to retain the built-in stand, you will notice a logo projection at the bottom, which I do think is a little bit pointless. Nonetheless, it's something that you can play around with. Equally, the RGB lights that are positioned at the back of the monitor are not anywhere near as bright as you might expect, and therefore won't compete with the likes of, for example, Philips Ambiglow. Nonetheless, it's just something that you might want to play around with, or indeed fully disable like I did, because I don't want my walls looking at the RGB lights, because it's completely pointless. Now here you have got the ability of disabling all of these, or indeed playing around with the settings via the monitor's OSD. This can be done via a small little joystick button that's found towards the center and at the back of the monitor. The monitor's OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out and fluid. It's very intuitive to use as well, and therefore makes it quite easy to adjust certain settings on the fly. Better still, you've also got the Asus display widget, which is a software that can be accessed if you connect the USB Type B to Type A cable. And this means that it allows you to adjust certain settings and even a bit more customization than what you would get via the hardware-based OSD. Now to conclude, I would like to quickly touch upon the other ports that are available on this monitor. And yes, you have got that DisplayPort 1.4 and 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, but you've also got that USB Type-C port as well, which can be handy if you're plugging in a laptop, because it'll allow you to simultaneously charge it as it delivers up to 90 watts of power delivery. Elsewhere, you've got 3 USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports, and these are quite handy because the monitor has got a built-in KVM switch, effectively allowing you to plug in your peripherals directly into the monitor, while meaning that you don't have to constantly connect or disconnect them if you're switching between a laptop and a desktop computer, which is connected up to the monitor itself via USB Type-C port and of course a HDMI or indeed a display port. If you want some more information about how a KVM switch actually operates, make sure you check out my detailed video up on your port banner or by following the links down in the description below. Apart from that, it is also worth mentioning that the monitor does not have any sort of built-in speakers, but it does have a 3.5mm jack output, which can be handy for plugging in your headphones, and you've also got a SPDIF output, which is quite a rarity. This means that you can connect it up to a receiver or indeed a set of bookshelf speakers that do accept an optical input. So with all that in mind, can I see myself recommending this Asus OLED monitor? Well, make no mistake, it's actually very expensive, and equally is also going to be a bit of a niche. It's only suitable, in my opinion, for those people who are hardcore competitive gamers who also do want to use the monitor for productivity's sake, or indeed want to use it with different games, such as if they want to enable HDR or VR technologies. However, if you're someone who does fall into that category and wants something of best of all worlds and is a little bit more future-proof, then effectively this monitor ticks every single box. It's supremely responsive, has got a fantastic HDR experience, has got good VR technology support, has got a nice build quality and design, is color accurate, and effectively has got that sort of good sort of flexibility with the connectivity options as well. As a result of all of this, it gets my Best Buy award. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below, be it if you can or can't afford it, and how you feel it actually does offer a different sort of proposition in the monitor market given its dual mode capabilities. Now if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated as it allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I hope you see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.